Good morning, folks. I'm just going to leave it just for a few seconds while we let people filter in. Ooh, I see somebody has their hand up already. That's a good sign. Just to say, as we go through, just a bit of housekeeping. If you do have any questions, obviously Sharon is going to speak and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. But if as she's speaking, you think of a question or you want a point of clarification, do pop them in to the chat and we'll deal with them at the end. But I think probably it's useful for people to, as things occur to them, if you need to get them down, throw it into the Q&A box or the chat box and we'll pick them up from there. Just to say welcome to everyone and thanks. It's a really good attendance, or at least sign up. We'll see what the attendance is for the talk today. And I think it speaks to the topic, but also to our speaker. This is one of our regular series of Simon Talks. And really what our Simon Talks are about is sharing the information that we find really important or really useful. Obviously, when we develop our kind of policy positions, both internal and external, but particularly for external, we lean on experts in different areas and collect up that information and put it through the lens of the experience of Simon and the experience of people who are at risk of or experiencing homelessness in order to try and address some of the structural issues and reduce homelessness in Ireland. But I also think there's a real value in if we find some experts who are particularly good, who I think can enhance the discourse, to be a part of providing a platform for those people to speak directly as well to the audience that Simon has, I think is something that's really powerful and really useful, rather than just getting the sort of filtered through our policy documents. So we have with us today Dr. Forgive me, I lost her name. Dr. Sharon Lambert, who joined the teaching staff in the School of Applied Psychology in UCC in 2014, following a number of years working with community-based settings, within community-based settings that provided supports to marginalised groups. Sharon's research interests revolve primarily around the impact of trauma on development. It's linked with substance dependence and mental health and consequence considerations for service designs and delivery. And certainly in my time of engaging with services, that's been really striking is we often talk about person-centered, meeting the person where they're at. And that work as often happens. I think the difference with trauma-informed, even as people talk to me about their experience of engaging in it, was it actually put them in the picture as well. And indeed the built environment into the picture as well, and it means we're providing better services, full stop, and I think addressing the holistic needs of people in really useful and important ways. So I'm going to hand over to Sharon now, who will speak for 20 minutes, half an hour. Sharon?
Yep.
Yeah, and then we'll go straight to the Q&A after that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Wayne. I'm just going to pull up my slides there. And they have disappeared. Give me 2 seconds. And they're always like 2 seconds ago they were there. Again. Where? That is incredible that 2 seconds ago they were there and now they're not. Oh, here we are. They're back again. Now. Okay, so I suppose it's a short kind of run through, and I'm going to work from the assumption that most people have an idea of what I'm talking about anyway. So what I wanted to talk about was, what do we mean when we mean trauma-informed? Because I suppose my experience is that 10 years ago when we started talking about this, people had an idea in terms of thinking about their own way of working. So they'd say, look, that's the way that I work. And especially, I suppose in my experience, people who worked in NGOs just kind of naturally understood what this was. And obviously in the last few years, it's been a much bigger level of interest across a whole range of sectors in what is trauma awareness and trauma informed. But of course, the danger with that then is that some people are, saying I'm trauma informed, maybe not thinking about what that really means. So I always think it's really handy to start off at the start and think about, well, what do we mean by trauma? So trauma is a unique individual experience. And I suppose the most important thing there is that it is a unique individual experience where, a person just really struggles to be able to deal with the amount of stress that's going on. So sometimes, I might hear somebody say, well, I experienced those difficulties as well. And, I didn't end up in addiction or whatever. I suppose a couple of years ago, conversations around this were a little bit more difficult because there was a very narrow view of who becomes homeless. Now we're in a situation where, there's a huge diversity in terms of who's experiencing homelessness and who's at risk of homelessness. And many of those people will experience that stress of the risk of homelessness or being homeless as a trauma. And for an awful lot of people, it is a trauma that is coming down on top of all the traumas that they've experienced. So why being trauma aware matters is that, and trauma, I suppose the philosophy of trauma informed practice is that it's underpinned by neuroscience and by psychology and by other domains within social sciences. So one of the things I suppose that we've always known is, what happens to your body when you get really stressed. So when you get really stressed, your fight or flight system is activated, and that's normal. It's supposed to happen. If your fight or flight system wasn't activated when you were stressed, you'd be in trouble. Because the whole purpose of it is to keep you on your toes and keep you on guard. So if I'm going to cross the road and there's a car coming really fast, my fight or flight system will kick in order to protect me so that I can act really quickly to get myself out of danger. So the stress response system is a very important thing. Unfortunately, there are some people who experience such a huge amount of stress that their fight or flight system is activated a lot, sometimes even when they're not in danger. But what we know is that when you get really, really stressed, that system is activated. And what happens in the brain is that your thinking center does not work as well. So that's your prefrontal cortex. So that's the part of the brain that deals with planning ahead, understanding consequences, being able to receive information. So sometimes when we're working with people, you can get frustrated because you can feel like you're saying the same thing over and over again, or you can get cross about, that they didn't make X decision, or you advise them to do something and they forgot to do it. So if we understand the impact of stress and trauma on thinking, then we don't get as cross because we understand, well, actually, that's what happens when people get stressed. The prefrontal cortex goes offline. That's an appropriate, normal response to stress. The other thing that's going on at the same time is the part of the brain that deals with emotional regulation is underactivated. So when that happens, when you're really, really stressed, it is really difficult to emotionally regulate yourself. Not because you have any kind of deficit, but because the brain is doing what it's supposed to do. It has activated your fight or flight response system, and now you're struggling to manage your emotions. So there are lots of different ways that we can respond to that when we can't respond or we can't deal with our own emotions. There's different ways we can respond to that. And one of the things that works really well is drugs and alcohol. So alcohol and drugs, in particular heroin and benzodiazepines, work really well at dampening down the emotional part of the brain. So I suppose the problem is that once you start on that path and you're using drugs and alcohol, then it creates all of these other issues for you. But what's important from a trauma-informed perspective is that we understand that for a lot of people, the level of stress and trauma that they're experiencing is so chronic that the only way that they're able to get up and put one foot in front of the other every day is if they take drugs and alcohol to help dampen down that emotional regulation center. So what's really interesting in the homelessness space is, 20 years ago, there was, a particular profile of the profile of people experiencing homelessness tended to be single men with addiction issues. For the first time ever, we now have people entering homelessness with no addiction issues and then develop an addiction as a result of the stress and trauma of being homeless. And then the final thing is that the fear center is overactivated. So that is the part that deals with fight or flight. So some people that we meet can seem quite difficult, challenging, when actually their brain is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, which is activating the fight or flight response system. So one of the things that we know is that the more stress and trauma you experience, it increases risk for developing a whole host of issues. Now, just because it's increased risk doesn't mean it's a probability. There are people who experience terrible stress and they don't develop these issues. And then there are people where their stress threshold really is breached and they just cannot manage their difficulties. So if you see here on the graph, if you look at the black, these are people who've experienced 4 or more adversities and their increased risk of depression, anxiety, mental illness, and the use of drugs and alcohol. So experiencing chronic stress is bad for your health, and it also puts people at increased risk of other issues. So it's really important that we're not, that we don't take a judgmental stance on that. This is often an appropriate response to somebody's chronic stress situation. So how much adversity do we have? So if you look there in yellow, that's Cork Simon service users. That's their childhood trauma profiles. If you look at the green, that's the general population. So you can see that adults experiencing homelessness in Cork Simon, for many of them, their childhoods were a very different path than many in the general population. And if we put the science, the neuroscience down on top of that, we know that the more you expose children to that type of stress, the more their fight or flight system is activated during childhood, then it increases their risks for drug and alcohol use as a response to the trauma that they've experienced. And then once they're on that pathway, it can lead to a whole host of other difficulties for them. Similarly, women in contact with the probation service at the time that this data was collected, 70% were either currently in homelessness or had experienced homelessness at some point in their lifetime. And, very similar profiles to the adults in Cork Simon. This data was collected in Limerick, but you're seeing the same childhood profiles. Young people involved in the criminal justice system. So we've more and more young people entering homelessness than we ever did before as well. So if you look there where the arrow is, for young people who were involved in criminal justice, 63% of them had experienced 4 or more adversities during childhood. You can compare that to the general population of 12.5%. I suppose the one that struck out to me a lot is if you scroll down along to loss of a parent. 71% of those young people had experienced the loss of a parent in comparison to 23% of the general population. Now, losing a parent, whether it's through divorce, abandonment, separation, or death, can be a traumatic experience for some people. So often you have young people who are very emotionally dysregulated and they can seem very angry and out of control. But actually what you have is a group of young people who are really sad and who are struggling to manage those emotions. So not only do you have people entering homelessness who may have had a trauma profile as children, they're now entering homelessness, which is a trauma for many. And if you have been sleeping out, you're at risk of sexual and physical violence, which is also a trauma. So if you're working in services, then you're surrounded by people who've experienced traumatic experiences. And some of those people might present in a way that is difficult to watch. As I said, some people might describe them as challenging. And then that can have an impact on us as workers. And I did work in the community with young people who were very marginalized. So that can put you at risk for compassion fatigue, especially because of what everybody has been through in the last couple of years with COVID. So we have some data from people working in frontline services, but that data was collected before COVID. And when we collected that data before COVID, what we found in the services that we looked at was 25% of the staff had burnout. And that was kind of consistent in different spaces. So compassion fatigue is the start of that journey where you get so exhausted from working in a job where you have to give away so much of yourself. And if you were fatigue, if you have a lot of compassion fatigue, you're at risk of secondary traumatic stress. If you don't do something to intervene, you're at risk of burnout. And some people who get burnout when they leave particular sectors, they don't come back. So we're at risk of losing absolutely incredible human beings from workforces because they're so stressed and they're finding it really, really difficult to have hope because things are very difficult with the cost of living crisis and the pressures on housing. So when staff are difficult, then what does that look like? So somebody might come to you, and uh, they're being challenged and they're being difficult, and actually what they're doing is trying to advocate for a client. But the more tired somebody is and the more worn out somebody is, the more difficult and challenging that advocacy can look like. So we have to step back and we have to look and say, well, why are they constantly giving out? And you say, well, it's always in relation to service users. So these are people who really, really care, but they're really tired and they're arguing with you. So in terms of being trauma aware or trauma informed, one of the things that you're supposed to do is advocacy. So what do I mean? So the purpose of this talk is to talk about what do I mean by trauma informed. The trauma informed is a destination. It's something you arrive at the end of a journey. It can take 3 to 5 years for a middle-sized organization to become fully trauma informed. There are some organizations that may never become trauma informed because they're just too large, and that's okay. You might say to yourself, well, we want to be a trauma aware organization or a trauma sensitive organization. But if we want to protect the integrity of the concept, then it's really important that people know that it is a journey and there's different stages to it, and to know what stage you're at. So if you were describing yourself as being in a trauma informed organization, but that organization is trauma aware, it's important that people know that. So what is a trauma aware organization? So a trauma aware organization is just the basic. So everybody in the organization understands what psychological trauma is and the impact that it has on thinking and behavior. Some people will move up to the next level by being a trauma sensitive organization. So things like being welcoming, maximizing safety, educating all of the staff, having family resources available, empowerment, use of first person language, promoting strength through practices, viewing holistically, sharing the vision across the system services. And this is where sometimes things can get complicated. The larger the organization is and the different parts of it, there might be one part that's doing really well on this, and then there might be another part that's lagging behind. So that's when you have to look and say, well, are we trauma aware or are we trauma sensitive? Because actually, this vision is not across our services. When Johnny comes into this building here, he has a very pleasant experience. But when he goes to our other service down the road, it is not so good. Then you're not trauma sensitive. There's a bit of work to be done there. And the other thing then is addressing staff issues. A trauma responsive organization then is one that recognizes and responds to traumatic stress. Some organizations screen for trauma history. That should never be done unless it serves a purpose. So you only screen for trauma history if you're in a position to provide appropriate resources for the person. Nobody should ever have to disclose their trauma in order to access the service. And people shouldn't have to be disclosing trauma across multiple services in order to get access. Strengthening resilience and protective factors, addressing the impact on the family, assisting children in reducing overwhelming emotions, and helping children make new meaning of their lives. And then finally, a fully trauma-informed organisation is a whole system that's based on an understanding of trauma. So every single policy and procedure has been reviewed. You have your trauma change team that meets regularly, and they're constantly, troubleshooting and updating areas that need to be worked on. You have an organisation that gives people physical and emotional safety, not just service users, but staff. It's recovery orientated, and you collaborate well with other agencies. The clients themselves have some kind of agency within the organisation. and there's empowerment through strength and resilience. So when I said it takes 3 to 5 years to become fully trauma informed, when you get there, that's not your end point, because you need to start all over again. And for me, eh, being a trauma informed organization, where does trauma informed fit within the organization's policies and procedures? It's everywhere. But I think particularly it's health and safety. So if you think about your health and safety policies, they're not something that you do once and then you just leave. There are constantly people checking to make sure that health and safety policies are up to date. Um, if we can never imagine every single scenario that will ever present to us. So, for example, if something happens that's unusual or different, then that's when your trauma change team sits down and they look and say, well, what happened? What could we have done differently? And what policies and practices do we need to look at? Now, sometimes people will say things like, well, we do it anyway. The problem is when we say, well, we do it anyway, is that then it's not built into our systems. So then when something does go wrong, you don't have a system where you sit down and you look at, well, what went wrong from a trauma-informed perspective. And yes, there are loads of people within organizations where they just do this naturally. But it's not enough to say that. You actually have to have a system in place where you can monitor, you can measure your progress, you can adapt and respond to issues as they arise. So the principles of trauma-informed practice need to be embedded within the organization. So that's safety. So physical and emotional. So Wayne mentioned there, being a fully trauma-informed service means that you have looked at your physical environment. How does it feel? So it's small things all the way up to really, really big things. So for example, some of the things I might notice when I go into a waiting room, and I'm sitting in the waiting room before I go in to meet somebody, and I look around at the posters that are on the wall. So it often happens when you go into services where people are working with addiction, and I look at the posters on the wall and they're all really negative. It'll be about all the ways you're going to die if you share needles. And there won't just be one poster about that, there might be six. And you think, well, if you take a methadone clinic, for example, everybody who's going into a methadone clinic knows that you shouldn't share needles. So you wouldn't need six posters to say that message. What you just need one of those, and you should be balancing it with some kind of poster that's about hope and recovery. Lots of people, when they work in organizations, don't spend any time sitting in the waiting room. Actually, there are places that they scurry through on their way from one place to another. So actually walking through a building as a service user, what is it like for them? What kind of paperwork do they fill out, and how much of it do they have to fill out? So that's where you think about the physical and emotional safety. And that's just to give you some examples. Trust, having consistency and clarity. Choice, having maximized choice and control. I see a lot in housing that there is very little choice and control. Sometimes when people try to exercise choice and control, there can be very negative conversations about them. So if somebody will say is offered a house in X location, and for whatever reason that is not physically or emotionally safe for them, they're seen as ungrateful and difficult and demanding because they won't live there. Whereas if we were trauma sensitive, we would step back and we'd say, I wonder what the difficulty is there, and how can we work with this person. The center of interest policy would not be a policy that's trauma informed. So for example, if God forbid, if I became homeless in the morning, I'm not originally from Cork, but I've been living here for a long time. Cork is not my centre of interest. But just supposing I became homeless in Cork in the morning, and there's a lot of trauma associated with Cork for whatever reason. I may have had a difficult childhood, and I rock up and I arrive in Limerick, and then I'm told that Limerick isn't my centre of interest and I must go back to Cork. Then that would not be a policy that understands that there's a reason why some traumatized people can't stay where they came from. I often think about it like a tree. You can plant a tree in your garden, in one part of your garden, and it just doesn't thrive because it doesn't like heavy clay soil, for example. And then you could pick it up and you could put it a few miles down the road in somebody else's garden, and they've got kind of limestone soil in their garden, and then the tree flourishes. And sometimes when people try to make those decisions, we don't think about it from their perspective. We just think about them as being difficult and challenging. The other thing is collaboration between child and family and all agencies. And like, it's easy to talk about collaboration, but I mean, it's real collaboration where, for example, when something goes wrong, you're honest enough to be able to sit down. I mean, I've been involved in these cases where, you know, a young person in care dies and there's a review. And what can often happen is all of the agencies retreat into their own worlds and then they start trying to point fingers at other agencies. You didn't do enough to help this child. And no learning can happen when we do that, because the only way we can ever make change in systems is if we can sit down and be really honest about, well, I think our service could have done this differently, and what we would have needed for that to work is this. And if we were honest and put the client at the center of that conversation instead of putting the service at the center of it, that would make huge change. And then empowerment, prioritizing skill building. Now, this is not the same as sometimes you hear it a bit in addiction and in homelessness and in mental health, where people say, oh, look, Sharon, you're enabling that person because you're making those phone calls for them. You prioritize skill building, but you also have to recognize where there are skill deficits. There are some people who can't do some of the tasks that we ask them to do, and sometimes we have to do it for them until they're in a position that they can do it for themselves. Trauma aware and trauma sensitive organizations don't use words like enabling. They assist people and help them to build those skills. You know, anybody who's working in homelessness will know that some of people who have chronic long-term homelessness have acquired brain injuries that have not been diagnosed. You know, so they might have had multiple falls, they might have been at victims of multiple assaults. So when we looked at the Cork Simon data, for example, we did a health and homelessness where we looked at the health of people. Like, there was a good chunk of some of the older men in particular, and some of the women, where they'd had multiple intensive care stays where they would have been unconscious for, you know, sometimes days, weeks, and longer. Because they present so chaotic and they are using drugs and alcohol, they really struggle to access the services that they need. So they often don't get the diagnosis of a brain injury, but they have it. So then things like memory and planning are a huge problem. And a lot of people argue with some of these individuals saying, you know, it's your responsibility to remember to turn up, et cetera, when we actually have a capacity issue there. So it's really important that we understand the difference between meeting people where they're at does not mean that you are enabling people. And then having cultural and gender competence. So I think everybody who works in an organization who wants to be trauma sensitive or trauma aware should have some kind of cultural training, not just in relation to immigrants and refugees, but also in relation to the traveller community. And then there needs to be gender competence as well. So understanding that sometimes men and women need different things, and that transgender people are a huge risk in our communities in terms of exclusion and violence. So what does the trauma aware worker look like? So a trauma aware worker is somebody who knows the difference between trauma informed and trauma specific. They understand the different types of abuse and trauma. They understand the impact of trauma in terms of, you know, how it impacts on a person physically, psychologically, its relationship to the development of substance use, mental health issues. They know the importance of physical and emotional safety of participants. They know the uselessness of confrontation of negative behaviors used by people to cope with their trauma. So somebody's being challenging in a moment, you being challenging back never ever worked. Never in the history of mankind has telling somebody to calm down ever worked. And that's because that part of the brain that deals with emotional regulation just isn't working. You know that trauma affects people differently throughout their lives, resulting in different issues at different times. So younger people tend to externalize more. So that's when you see the more kind of chaotic, what some people would describe as aggressive behavior. But if we changed our language around that and we said, you know, they are trauma symptoms, knowing that there's culturally different responses to trauma, and knowing that people will express their stress differently. So some people can get really angry, some people can get very avoidant, When people become avoidant, sometimes we say that they're not motivated or they're not doing enough to help themselves. When actually the tools that they need in order to be motivated to get help, they just don't have them. And then us, if you are a worker, when we have stress responses, this happens to us too. So when I'm really, really stressed, I tend to get very cross. Um, does that mean that I'm a very difficult and angry person? Sometimes maybe that's what it looks like. But actually, my stress response system, my go-to is to get mad. That's where I go. That doesn't mean that I'm a bad person. It just means that that's the way my brain recognizes stress, and it says Sharon is stressed, therefore there must be danger. Activate our fight or flight response system. So how do we respond then? So by having an organizational culture that understands that there are a significant amount of people in our communities who have experienced more than their fair share of stress, and that people who work in an organization are carrying the brunt of that stress. And a lot of the people that I know who work from their heart and their gut do not do enough to take care of themselves. And then when you don't take care of yourself, you're at risk of making mistakes or of responding badly to a situation. And people who really care like to have integrity in their work. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're really burnt out and you don't care and you feel hopeless and you're not responding the way that you wanted to, then that's ultimately bad for your mental health too. Having access to really good supervision, and what's interesting to me, having looked at this actually from a research perspective, is that there's a huge confusion about what is supervision. So when I talk to people about, their experiences of supervision, what they describe to me is line management. It's not supervision. So that's something that organizations need to look at. Are you giving supervision, or are people coming in and spending an hour talking about annual leave, rotas, things like that? That's a different process, and that's not what supervision is supposed to be about. Also, we have to ask about the power dynamic in supervision. So if I'm a manager and I'm providing supervision to my team, if you have, newer members of staff or younger members of staff, do they feel like they can come in and talk about how they're struggling, or are they worried that there will be a consequence for them if their manager thinks that they're not up for the job? Also, if I'm the manager and I have to make difficult decisions, so we'll suppose two staff members come and they both want the same day off, and I can't do that. I can only give one of them the day off, and now one of them is really pissed off at me, and then I have to go in 2 days later and do supervision. Is it really supervision if I'm the line manager and I've made decisions that they're cross about? Have they the space to be able to be cross, because it's actually important? Having reflective practice. So we all make mistakes. When something goes wrong and something kicks off, we're all involved in it and we all play a part in it. And the only way we'll ever be able to prevent those issues occurring in the future is if we have a space to sit down and say, well, when Johnny came in the other day and he kicked off and this is what happened. So having a space at least once every 2 weeks where you have a reflective practice group, where you sit down and you take a specific incident that occurred and you do a psychological autopsy on it and you say, what went wrong and what was my role in it? Well, I came in and I was in a bad form because I was exhausted. And when he came in and he was mad, I responded badly, which made him worse, and it all kicked off. There's nothing wrong with admitting that, like, it is not possible to be perfect all of the time. And we all have personal lives, and we all have our own stressors. I can think of times when I worked with young people where it escalated very quickly from them being slightly pissed off to them going absolutely bananas. And what was the factor in that was that I wasn't actually in great form. And when they got pissed off, how I responded wasn't the most ideal way to respond to that, and it escalated. That doesn't mean that I'm a bad person. It just means that I'm a human being. What would make me an ineffective practitioner is if I wasn't prepared to sit down and look at what role I played in it, and if I wasn't prepared to learn something from it. And that can only happen if we create a safe space for people to do that. Being trauma aware then, and practicing self-compassion. And I suppose where I'm at with this stuff now is, I suppose I've been talking about this stuff for 7 or 8 years now in a public way. We would have been, I was working in an organization where we practiced it, but I've been talking about it in a public way. I would guess that most people know what trauma aware or trauma informed organizations are now. So I suppose the challenge I'm throwing down to people now is, okay, beyond trauma. So we know what causes trauma. We know the impact that it has on people's functioning. When we have people who are traumatized in our communities, we know the impact that it has on communities. So it's never just the individual who's impacted. We're all impacted when we have people who are traumatized. So now we have to say, well, it would be great if we have trauma sensitive organizations that can respond and give people the best services that they can get. We need to move beyond that, and we need to say now we need to push for reducing trauma. So if you have 3,000 children in homelessness, that's a trauma experience. We have to get those children out of homelessness as fast as possible. Children recover quite quickly from trauma if you intervene very quickly. If we leave children in very difficult situations, we are pushing them at risk of being the adults who will be in homelessness, of being the adults who will be in addiction, of being the adults who are involved in the criminal justice system. So to be fully trauma informed, you have to go beyond your organization. You have to be involved in advocacy, and you have to be noisy, in my opinion, because we have to try to break those cycles of trauma. Because I don't want to be still having the same conversation in 10 years' time, because you have all of these systems that are actually perpetuating trauma. So that was about 6 hours of what I wanted to say in about 20 minutes. So I hope that it made sense. It was a very fast run through, and I'm happy to take any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you, Sharon. That was superb. It was really comprehensive, and you packed an awful lot in there. So I'm good. There's a number of questions starting to come in, which is great. The first question was, would eating, I'll actually add an addendum to this, but would eating disorders be included in the list of increased risk due to trauma? Many women we support struggle with eating disorders, but because of their substance use, it isn't seen or supported. And sort of as an addendum to that, one of the things that you're talking about, and I think part of it is because it was truncated, is you're talking about recognizing sort of what, when you're working in services, traditionally you would have thought as acting out or aggressive behavior or whatever as trauma and a response to trauma. But is there also within it a thinking about how people who act in, so maybe the person who goes quiet and maybe because they're not problematic, maybe gets, you know, it's seen as the good the good person to work with, but actually that's a form of their trauma as well. And how do we balance those kind of thinking? So thinking beyond that.
Yeah. So when our fight or flight response system is activated, you have fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And actually, a lot of people don't think about the fawning. So the fawning is, you see this a lot of, particularly in people who've experienced domestic violence and coercive control. So your brain responds to your environment and it learns patterns of behavior, and it says, right, in order to be safe, you need to do X. So fighting is an obvious one. In order to be safe, you need to fight. But actually, so when we see those people, we go, okay, they're very cross. This is their trauma response. I can understand that. But then there's this group of people who do turn it inwards, and things like eating disorders, self-harm, very quiet self-harming behaviors. And then they do this thing called fawning. So what happens with that group of people is they're actually very easy to work with because they don't cause you any problems, but they don't get their needs met. So their brain has said, in order to be good, in order to be safe, I need to be good all the time. I cannot cause any trouble. So you could be working with somebody and you could say, oh, look, here, we're going to deliver this service for you. And then they say, okay, even though being involved in that might put them at risk of harm, because their brain is jumping in saying, don't cause trouble. If you cause trouble, if you make somebody mad, you are at risk. So those people sometimes get lost, and it's no harm every now and again just taking a step back. If you're working with somebody who's too easy to work with, ask yourself, are they really having their needs met, or are they just saying yes to everything because they don't want to be difficult? In terms of the eating disorders, so there probably isn't either a physical illness or mental illness on the planet that hasn't been studied in relation to trauma exposure, and eating disorder is one of those. So is addiction. So we know that a good chunk of people in addiction have experienced trauma. Not everybody, but actually a good chunk. In eating disorders as well, is that there's a good chunk of people with eating disorders who have experienced the trauma. Not all, but a good chunk. Then you have the problem of dual diagnosis. So whether it's eating disorder or depression or anxiety or whatever it is, once somebody has a mental health problem, or once somebody uses drugs or alcohol, then they struggle to access the services. So it's a long time now since Lee McGowan from I always get I don't know whether it's DCU or UCD, and I should know that because I know Liam very well. But he wrote a report about dual diagnosis a number of years ago, and there was a lot of recommendations in that. I think the last time I looked, only one of them had been implemented. It's a huge problem. Eating disorders is a very scary issue. There's a very high death rate within eating disorders when they're not treated. And what happens with any dual diagnosis is that Ireland has the second or third highest rate of drug-related death in Europe. So when you are excluding people from services because they are using drugs, we're increasing their risk of dying. I get a phone call probably once a week from somebody who's normally a parent of an adult child, where they're absolutely at their wits' end because their loved one's mental health is so bad that addiction services feel like they can't support them. And then they bring them to mental health services. Mental health services say because they have addiction issue, they can't work with them, and then they're stuck in the middle. And unfortunately, some of those people die. So this is what I mean by beyond trauma. Like, we know this, so now we need to advocate for those groups of people.
Okay.
So that was a very long answer, but
No.
it's a very
I think it was
complicated
really,
issue.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that question of how we move sort of beyond service provision and into prevention, I think is a really important one, and one that I think most of the sector who deal with homelessness think that is, it's absolutely critical if we're going to. Prevention is a big part of how we address homelessness. Sorry, I'm just going to catch up, and there's more questions coming in, which is great. So Vicky asks, you mentioned that drugs and alcohol help the underactivated emotional regulation center of people experiencing trauma. Could you expand a little bit on that, and how does this happen?
So when you use drugs and alcohol, they obviously have an impact on the brain. And anyone who's stressed, look, I could go on this evening and I could say, oh, I'm really stressed. And I could be driving home from work and I'll feel it in my shoulders. And I'll say, oh, when I go home now, I'll have a hot bath. And then I go home and the heating's broken, so I can't have a hot bath. And there's something else wrong, something else. And then I get more and more stressed. And then you end up having a glass of wine. And immediately, it has an impact. And what it does is it helps to dampen down. We did a study actually before I ever came to work in UCC. When I worked with young people, a lot of our young people were using very high levels of benzos in a very risky way. And one of the things, the number one reason why they were using benzos is because it helps you not to feel. So when you're emotionally dysregulated and you take a substance that dampens down that area of the brain, then it helps you not to feel. It's one of the things I love about the Two Norries podcast is when you hear people who are in recovery talking about their drug use, and they would talk about how they struggled. They might have experienced something really, really horrific, and they just could not manage how horrific that issue was. And when they took drugs and alcohol, it took the pain away. And many of them would say that, but for the fact that they had used drugs and alcohol, that they would not have been able to manage their level of emotional stress and that they may have died by suicide. So most people, I think, who work in frontline services know that, but actually we still have a big group of people in Ireland who have a very judgmental approach to people in addiction and who see it as a choice, and that somebody has chosen to do this as opposed to it was actually the only choice that they had at the time in order to keep themselves alive. So when I see people who are struggling with addiction, I don't see people who are weak. I see people who are incredibly strong, who are trying to fight to stay alive. And our job then is to come in and support them so that they can stay alive and that they can have a life of recovery and hope.
I did some training many years ago with a guy called Piers Allett, who's in the HSE and worked in mental health recovery. And he one of his ways of doing the training was he provide case example people's personal experiences. And one that stuck out for me was a woman who had been diagnosed in her teens as schizophrenic, and the impact that the diagnosis had on her, not necessarily her illness per se, although obviously her illness was, and she ended up self-regulating using alcohol and drugs. And she ended up in a rehab service where she met a psychologist who sort of said, well, look, you have a really good insight. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to send you for therapy. I'm going to send you to the therapist and they're going to tell you what the tools that they use. And she went away. And he said, what was interesting about her story was she went away and she decided she was an addict. But it was the first, and as in the way she'd written it, it was really clear that deciding that she was an alcoholic for her was actually a breakthrough point. Now, it took her a couple of years to recover from that because she had to deal with the addiction. But actually taking control of her diagnosis was really important. So all of a sudden, it was a mechanism for control.
And I just want to come in on that because that's really interesting. Is one of the things that's really important in terms of people who've experienced a lot of adversity is psychoeducation. So people in particular who are in kind of very chaotic addiction sometimes are very often have a very negative view of themselves, and they think that the reason why they're in the situation that they're in is because they're not good enough. And I once a year I speak to a group of service users in Cork Simon who are doing really well, and they're doing various different training courses, and one of the things I talk about is stress and the impact of stress on thinking and behavior. And what's really profound is for many it's the first time that they found out that actually this is what your brain does, and it sometimes does these things unconsciously. And I'll never forget, I remember one man becoming really upset, and he would have experienced quite chronic long-term homelessness, and he's doing really well. And he had this internalized view that he was a scumbag. That's the word that he used. And that the reason why he had ended up in addiction and the reason why he'd ended up homelessness was because he was a scumbag. And this was his first time learning. So for most people, it is obvious that when something bad happens to you, that it can have a consequence on your mental health. And that's mental health literacy. There's a huge chunk of people, particularly men, who don't have mental health literacy. And the more marginalized you are, the less likely you are to have that. So for him, it was the first time where he realized that the journey he had taken was not one where he had made deliberate choices to go on that journey, but that journey was a consequence of limited choices that were available to him. And I often wonder if in terms of that early intervention, so that people don't have this internalized view of themselves. And when I hear people talking really negative, so people say, oh, it's a disgrace, the homeless people in the city and they're out of control and their behavior and it's shocking, we shouldn't have to look at things like that. Nobody feels as much shame as the person who's actually in that situation. So we don't need to go on and further shame them. In fact, what we need to do is give them psychoeducation so that they know that the limited decisions that they have is not their fault. And that's why I'm going to come back to the Two Norries podcast again, because I was on that podcast. And one of the things that struck me about it was that it's a podcast that is very accessible. to a lot of different people, and it's played into the prisons.
Mm.
So people are getting access to information that they wouldn't ordinarily get, and information that we take for granted if you've ever had the opportunity to go to college. And I've spoken to a couple of people, like probation officers and things, and they would say, you know, that they've noticed a shift in their clients. So instead of clients coming saying, I'm really fucked up and I don't know what I need, what they're coming with now is a different language. So they're coming and they're saying, I'm really distressed because X and Y happened. And I think that that's a big problem in terms of my ability to manage my addiction. And what I think I need is, so rather than coming and saying, I'm fucked up, I don't know what to do, they're actually coming with a different language. That's an example of an intervention. But we need to be doing it much earlier, not when they've had the misery of addiction and homelessness and breakdown of relationships and, you know, clocking up all these criminal charges, which impacts on them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. Sorry, I'm just conscious. I want to get to there's one more. Sorry, two questions. But trauma can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a significant diagnosis needing specific care. Isn't there a need for services to recognize same and provide specialist care? And any thoughts on wellness programs or lack thereof in service organizations? I think they're actually two separate questions, but they're separate.
There are lots of people that I have worked with who have experienced significant amounts of trauma, and they have never been diagnosed with trauma-related disorders because they present as so challenging and so difficult. I suppose what I see in younger people is they're diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, and that concerns me. Because you look at a child, you know, and we know we'll say that they've experienced all these highly traumatic situations, and then they're given that diagnosis. That diagnosis often excludes them from other services. We have a huge amount of adults. If you look at homelessness, for example, I mean, if I had to sleep on the street and I was experienced sexual and physical violence as a result of that, there is a risk that I would develop post-traumatic stress. We know that there's a thing called rape trauma syndrome, for example. But if I present challenging, I might be diagnosed with something else. And then the problem with that is that I might not get the actual service that I need. Not all services are equipped to provide trauma counselling. If people are in a position to hire specialists to do that, that's amazing. But we also have to have statutory services that are trauma informed and provide those services. And we need to be able to refer and signpost people to services that are safe. The World Health Organization and the UN, I think it was 2 years ago, and I was really delighted to see this, released a statement saying, we kind of need to look at the way in which we think about mental health, particularly for people at the kind of, you know, really extreme end of it. Some of the things that they do are absolutely appropriate emotional responses for the situation that they're in. But what are we saying to them and about them, and what diagnoses are we given? With all of the young people I worked with, and some of those young people had very extreme trauma histories in their childhood. I never worked with a child who had been diagnosed with a trauma disorder, but I worked with kids who've been diagnosed with conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder and all sorts of other things. And yeah, they would come in and they would be angry, but that was an appropriate response for the situation that they were in, and they were being diagnosed as oppositional defiant based on that one response. And actually, some of the kids that we worked with, when we would bring them to other places, they would behave differently. You could be working with somebody who's an absolute dote, and then you bring them to an organization and they totally kick off. And it's because the organization was not physically or emotionally safe. So for example, I remember bringing a young person to a particular service, and we walked in the door, and he was a working class kid, and he was wearing a tracksuit, and he was wearing a gold chain, and his tracksuit was tucked into his socks. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's the way his peers dress in his community. And when we walked in the door, the first person that we met looked him up and down. And I could feel it, and I knew that he could feel it. And I mean, I know myself as somebody who's nearly 50, if I come into work and I'm feeling like crap and I haven't slept properly and one of the kids has been sick or something, I've half brushed my hair, if I catch somebody looking me up and down, it makes me feel like crap. But I'm nearly 50, so I can kind of manage myself. But if I was 15, I could see why I would kick off. So yes, we need more specialist services. Not every service needs to provide it. We certainly need them to be available. And then the last one is in relation to wellness, is that we don't do it very well. I think that organizations really want to address wellness in staff, and I think that it's so huge that sometimes they don't know how. So for example, where I work, I'll get an email today saying, there's a mindfulness workshop on tomorrow. It'll be on during the lunch break from 1 to 2. I want to eat my lunch. So if we wanted to really do it, we have to think about what are we providing? Is it accessible? Is it useful? There's a lot of wellness initiatives in organizations that are not used at all. Employee assistance programs are an example. Very low uptake of counseling in employee assistance programs. Staff who work in and I did a bit of research on this. I looked at actually with nurses. They don't ring that phone number because they don't trust the organization that they work in. They think that when they ring EAP, that whatever the organization they work in will be told, Sharon Lambert rang today and she's getting 6 sessions of counselling. So if you're bringing EAP into your service, have you really explained how it works? And another thing as well is Ireland is very small. I don't use the EAP and UCC. Why do I not use it? Because Ireland is very small. So I will ring, a random phone number. I will give all of my details, and then they will assign me to somebody. That somebody could be somebody I was in class with. I don't want them to know that I'm having a difficult time. So I have a psychologist that I go to when I'm concerned about my mental health. So there are ways. So if you had an EAP service where I can go online and I can see the names and the pictures of the people who are delivering to my organization. And then I can say, okay, I know none of those. And I like the look of that fellow Wayne there. I'd like to go to Wayne. So I could click on you and book an appointment with you. And then I have control. I have choice. And there is transparency. So organizations do implement things coming from a good place, but they don't then say, why is it not working?
Okay. So I think maybe that's a nice way of thinking. Just the person I put in additional, sorry, which I missed, was that their questions are very much relate to trauma-informed implementation in services, which I think you've covered there at the end. But I suppose just in our last 2 minutes, if there are people in organizations where maybe they're starting out on that journey or they want to start out on that journey of trauma-informed care, and what are the first steps that you would say to an organization coming to it brand new?
Form a trauma change team. So you bring together a coalition of the willing. In every single organization I've ever been to, there are people who almost know, who sometimes know more than I do because they read so much all of the time and they're really, really interested in this. So you harness those people and you give them time. You say, right, you have this amount of time, you meet once a month and you form a trauma change team. So that trauma change team then has to do an assessment of the organization. So what's the organization's capacity to be trauma informed, if that's what you're aiming for? I would say aim for the first level. So trauma aware, then trauma sensitive. So you say, right, we want to be trauma aware within 12 months, trauma sensitive within 2 years, trauma responsive within 3. So then you need to know what do you need to do in order to reach those goals. And you need to set out a work plan. So normally one of the first things that people do is an organizational assessment. There are organizational assessments available for free online. You get staff service users involved. And then the next step then is making sure that every single member of the organization is at a minimum trauma aware, and they receive some kind of training on it. And you just keep doing that and you keep revisiting it and you set a goal and you test a goal. Where this falls down is where the momentum doesn't keep going. So the trauma change team has to be supported so that the momentum keeps going. And at every single meeting you ever have in your organization about anything, if it's fire extinguisher training, I don't care what it is, trauma, especially in homelessness, it's your all day, every day. whether it's the service users or whether it's the impact on the staff. It's your all day, every day trauma. So every single meeting should have trauma on the agenda, just as an open item. What's going on that we need to look at? Anything, major incidents, how are we getting on with policies, how are we getting on in terms of moving the organization forward?
That's brilliant, Sharon. Thank you. And spot on the 2 minutes. Well done. We're exactly at 11 o'clock. So I'm going to.
That's not like me.
It's not like me either. So we're doing well. Just to say, thanks very much for coming to talk to us. And I think we will hopefully have you on again, maybe to talk more about that kind of structural, how we move up into the.
Oh. I don't know if Wayne is frozen or if I'm frozen.
Talk.
Right.
You were frozen there for a second.
Sorry. Thanks, Wayne.
Thanks so much.